you happy for the boys with respect to Patrick Reed?
And I think Tiger's dealing with it and Patrick's dealing with that. And they didn't like what they saw and they came out and obviously you guys asked them questions about it and everything's basically said. You know, there's nothing more to be said.
Picture a golfer who carried the American flag at the Ryder Cup, went point for point against Europe's best, and was called a warrior by the men who stood beside him on those fairways. A man who won a Masters, collected 8 PGA Tour titles, and played some of the most clutch golf anyone had seen in a generation. Now picture that same man eating alone in the locker room while his teammates looked the other way. Patrick Reed is one of the most talented golfers of his era. He's also one of the most disliked. Not by strangers, not by critics in the media, by the men who played alongside him, roomed with him, and watched him up close for years. So what did the PGA legends who knew him best actually say about Patrick Reed? Before the controversies, before the falling outs, before any of it, there was a kid from San Antonio who played golf like he had something to prove every single time he teed it up. Patrick Reed turned professional in 2011, and it didn't take long for people to notice. He won on the PGA Tour in his first full season, then he won again, then again. By the time the Ryder Cup came around in 2014, Reed was playing the kind of golf that makes grown men stop what they're doing and watch. And at that Ryder Cup, he became something bigger than a tour winner. In Gleneagles, Reed went up against Rory McIlroy in a singles match that had the entire golf world locked in. McIlroy was the world #1. Reed was the upstart. And Reed beat him, 1-up on the final hole with a crowd that largely wanted him gone, cheering against every shot he hit. He pumped his fist. He fed off the hostility. He played better because of it. The nickname Captain America arrived right around then, and for a brief stretch, it fit perfectly. Here was an American golfer with the guts and the competitive fire the Ryder Cup demands. Jordan Spieth said afterward that Reed was born for that stage. 2 years later at Hazeltine, Reed delivered again. He went 3-0 in the 2016 Ryder Cup, taking on the role of team warrior that nobody else seemed to want as loudly as he did. He talked. He gestured to the crowd. He won. By then, the legend of Captain America was fully formed, and the fans who watched him play embraced it without hesitation. But behind the patriotism and the fist pumps, something else was forming, something quieter and less visible. The same qualities that made Reed extraordinary on a Ryder Cup Sunday, the intensity, the self-belief, the refusal to defer to anyone, were making him genuinely difficult to be around the rest of the time. The locker room started to feel the friction that the grandstands never saw. Phil Mickelson, who had been one of America's Ryder Cup pillars for 2 decades before Reed arrived, was among the first to signal that not everything was harmonious. Mickelson has never been direct about Reed in public, but his body language at team events and the things he chose not to say in interviews spoke clearly enough. When asked about team chemistry in the lead-up to the 2018 Ryder Cup in Paris, Mickelson's answers were careful in ways they usually aren't. He talked about effort and preparation. He didn't talk about Reed. That 2018 Ryder Cup in Paris became the moment the tension between Reed and the broader Team USA dynamic broke into the open. Reports emerged that Reed had been left off several pairings by Captain Jim Furyk, not because of his golf, but because other players didn't want to play with him. Tiger Woods, who had been brought back to the team as a player and a senior figure in the room, reportedly had little to say on Reed's behalf when the pairings were being set. Reed ended up playing mostly alone, in the foursomes and four-balls formats where chemistry between partners matters more than almost anything. While the rest of the team paired up around him, he still won his singles match. He almost always did in Ryder Cups. But the image of Reed as a lone figure, isolated within the team he was supposed to be the heart of, told its own story. Nobody had a closer view of Patrick Reed's talent, or paid a higher price for standing beside it, than Jordan Spieth. Spieth and Reed were golf's great bromance for a stretch. They paired together at the 2014 and 2016 Ryder Cups, and were practically unbeatable. 2 young Americans, different in almost every way. Spieth, the articulate, media-trained golden boy from Dallas. Reed, the blunt, combative grinder who seemed to enjoy rubbing people the wrong way, but somehow locked in together on the course in a way that produced results neither could fully explain. Spieth called their partnership special, and when it was working, it genuinely was. They read each other's games intuitively. They picked each other up. The sum was bigger than the parts. Then it stopped. By the 2018 Ryder Cup, Spieth and Reed weren't pairing together anymore. The official line was tactical. The actual story, pieced together from interviews and reporting over the following years, was more personal. Something had broken between them, and whatever it was, Spieth wasn't in a hurry to discuss it publicly. When journalists asked about Reed in the years that followed, Spieth's answers got shorter and more clipped each time. He would acknowledge the golf. He wouldn't say anything more. Dustin Johnson, one of the longest hitters in tour history and a man who plays golf with minimal drama, was blunter in private circles, though characteristically brief in public. Johnson's camp made clear over time that he had no interest in being paired with Reed at team events. a preference that aligned with what several other players around the American team were signaling. When the most laid-back player in the world makes a point of keeping his distance, the message is hard to miss. Now, make sure to like and subscribe, and now back to the video. Bubba Watson, another Ryder Cup veteran and a man who wears his emotions openly, has spoken about team dynamics with a frankness that most tour players avoid. Watson's position on Reed was never openly hostile. He understood competitive fire because he had plenty of his own, but he acknowledged that Reed existed in a different social world to the rest of the locker room. There was Reed, and then there was everyone else. And the gap between them wasn't something you could paper over with team gear and matching logos. Everything that had been simmering broke into full public view in January 2020 at the Farmers Insurance Open at Torrey Pines. Reed was in a greenside bunker on the 11th hole. He took a practice swing, and the footage showed his club making contact with the sand behind the ball in a way that appeared to improve his lie. He was assessed a 2-stroke penalty. He accepted it, played on, and finished the round. And then, in his post-round interview, he told reporters the penalty was wrong. He insisted he had done nothing intentional. He looked directly into the cameras and argued with total conviction that the rules officials had made an error. The footage disagreed. Every golfer who watched it had the same reaction. What made it worse wasn't just the swing, it was the denial. Golf is a sport built on self-reporting. Players call penalties on themselves. They walk over to officials and admit what happened. The entire culture of the game runs on the assumption that the person holding the club will tell the truth about what the club did. When a player stands in front of cameras and tells a different story to what millions of viewers just watched with their own eyes, something fundamental breaks. It doesn't matter how many majors you've won or how many Ryder Cup matches you've taken down. You've just told the sport you grew up in that you don't play by its oldest rule. Brooks Koepka was the first major name to say it plainly. Koepka has never been the kind of man to search for the polite version of an opinion, and his read on the situation was delivered with the kind of flat certainty that made it land harder than a long speech would have. "You know where your club is," he said, with a pause before it that made the rest of the sentence unnecessary. He wasn't angry about it. He just treated it as obvious. The way you'd explain something to someone who already knows the answer and is pretending they don't. Coming from Koepka, who by that point had won 4 majors of his own and had no reason to take a public position on anything involving Reed, those 5 words carried real weight. He wasn't performing outrage. He was just stating a fact and letting it sit. Peter Kostis went further than almost anyone. Kostis had spent decades as a CBS broadcaster and swing analyst, watching golfers at ranges most people never get. He wasn't a pundit with an agenda. He was someone who had stood close enough to thousands of tour players to know exactly what controlled movement looks like and what deception looks like. And what Kostis said stopped the conversation cold. He said he had personally seen Reed improve his lie 4 times. Not once. Not at Torrey Pines alone. 4 separate occasions, witnessed directly, up close. Think about what that number means. One incident at Torrey Pines could be argued. Badly, but argued. A misread of the rules, a misunderstanding, an honest mistake in a high-pressure moment. Once is a controversy. Once lets the benefit of the doubt survive. Barely, if you squint at it. But 4 incidents witnessed by a man with Kostis's experience and credibility isn't a misunderstanding. It's a method. It's the difference between a slip and a habit. And Kostis didn't say it on a podcast or in a throwaway social media post. He said it on television, attached his name to it, and let it stand. Once that number was in the public record, every future bunker shot Reed played would be watched through a different lens. Brandel Chamblee drew the line as directly as it can be drawn. The Golf Channel analyst has built a career on saying what other broadcasters avoid, and on the Reed situation, he didn't look for a softer landing. He said that defending what Reed did at Torrey Pines meant defending cheating, not bending the rules. Not a gray area. Cheating. Full stop, no qualifications, and no invitation to argue back. Reed's legal team reportedly responded with threats of legal action, and that response, more than anything Chamblee had said, turned a sports controversy into something the broader media couldn't ignore. Chamblee didn't back down. He stood by every word. The legal threats generated more coverage than the original segment had. Journalists who might have moved on started digging. Sports lawyers gave interviews. And every day the story stayed alive, it kept pointing back to the same footage, the same bunker, the same swing. Reed's decision to respond with lawyers instead of evidence didn't close the story. It extended it indefinitely. Paul Azinger, who had captained the United States to a Ryder Cup win in 2008 and knew better than most what it cost to build a team around mutual trust, gave his verdict in 4 words. "We're going to watch him like a hawk." Those words need to be understood for exactly what they were. This wasn't anger. It wasn't a call for punishment. It was something colder and more permanent. Azinger was saying that the benefit of the doubt was gone and wasn't coming back. He was announcing on television, in front of everyone who followed the game, that the standard applied to Patrick Reed had changed. Every bunker shot from that point forward would be scrutinized differently. Every time his club came near sand or loose soil in a situation where the lie could be improved, cameras would find it. Officials would watch. The viewers who had seen the Torrey Pines footage would remember. Ozinger didn't threaten Reed. He just described the new reality plainly, and the plainness of it made it stick. Rory McIlroy, who had been one of Reed's most visible opponents at Ryder Cups and had watched him up close for years, gave an interview not long after, in which he said the most damaging thing you can say about a professional golfer, that what Reed did had damaged trust. Not just within the American team, within the sport itself. McIlroy didn't shout it. He said it quietly, carefully, in the measured tone of a man who had thought about it before speaking, which made it land harder. McIlroy understood the stakes because he had played Reed in front of enormous crowds and felt the competitive electricity the man generated. For someone who respected the opponent that much, to sit down and say the word trust in a sentence about him with that expression on his face was its own kind of verdict. The Torrey Pines incident wasn't isolated. Allegations of rules violations had followed Reed long before the bunker footage, most notably from his college days at the University of Georgia and then Augusta State, where he was reportedly dismissed from both programs under circumstances that included accusations of cheating in competition. Reed has consistently denied those accounts, and the details have never been fully settled in any formal process. But they added a layer to the conversation that the Torrey Pines footage made impossible to ignore. The college stories, which had mostly lived in the background of golf media for years, suddenly felt relevant again. Journalists started republishing them. Former teammates from those programs started getting calls. And the picture that assembled itself wasn't of a man who had one bad moment in a bunker in January 2020. It was of a man whose relationship with the rules of the game had been questioned at almost every level he'd played. Tiger Woods, by that point, one of the most measured voices on tour, kept his public distance from the Reed controversy, but the silence from Woods was pointed in its own way. During the years when Reed was being questioned over rules issues, Woods, who had spoken openly about the integrity of the game through his own difficult public period, chose not to use his platform to defend him. Other players get defended. Other players, when controversy lands on them unfairly, find teammates and former partners willing to go on record. Woods said nothing. And in the world of professional golf, where status matters and where a word from Tiger can shift a narrative entirely, that silence landed like a statement. What makes the Patrick Reed story genuinely complicated is that none of the friction, none of the isolation, none of the controversy appeared to slow him down on the golf course. In April 2018, he won the Masters. He stood on the 18th green at Augusta National in a green jacket and wept. Whatever was happening behind the ropes, whatever the locker room thought of him, whatever Spieth and Johnson and Mickelson and McIlroy had said or chosen not to say, none of it stopped him from winning the most prestigious tournament in golf. He played all 4 rounds under pressure, held off Ricky Fowler and Spieth down the stretch, and closed it out. The win was real. The jacket was real. The moment was real. But watch the footage of that Sunday carefully. Watch not just Reed, but the people around him. Going into the final round, Reed held a 3-shot lead. That's a position most professionals would describe as comfortable at almost any other course. Augusta is not almost any other course. The back nine at Augusta on Sunday has swallowed 3-shot leads before and asked no one's permission to do it. Reed knew that. He had watched enough Masters to understand exactly what the place could take from you between the 10th tee and the 18th green, and he held it together anyway. His iron play was precise when it needed to be. His putting was steady when the pressure was at its highest. When Fowler and Spieth both made runs at him, he answered with birdies of his own. That is not luck. That is a man at the top of his competitive ability, doing what he was built to do. He finished at 15 under par. He pulled on the green jacket with his hands shaking slightly, and then he wept, genuinely and without any attempt to compose himself, in front of cameras that broadcast it to millions of people. For a man so often described as cold and calculating, it was a disarming moment. Whatever you believed about Patrick Reed, the person, Patrick Reed the golfer, had just won the most storied tournament in the world. The room around him didn't quite match the moment. Ricky Fowler, who finished second that day, is one of the most genuinely warm and well-liked players the tour has produced in the last 20 years. His personality isn't constructed for the cameras. People who know him say it's the same off-screen. So when Fowler is gracious in defeat, it usually comes naturally, and it came naturally that Sunday. He acknowledged Reed had played better golf. He said the right things in the scoring area and at the presentation ceremony. But Fowler's interviews in the weeks that followed were conspicuous for one thing. He almost never mentioned Reed by name when talking about the tournament. He talked about Augusta, about the back nine, about the pins on Sunday and the condition of the greens. The man who beat him barely featured. You could read his post-Masters media coverage and come away with almost no information about the person who actually won. That detail is small on its own, but it fits the pattern. The wins happened. The respect in the personal sense never arrived to meet them. Spieth finished third. He walked onto the 18th green and did what the sport expects of you. He congratulated the winner. The footage of that handshake is worth watching more than once. These are two men who had been described for years as brothers in arms. They had stood in fairways at Gleneagles and Hazeltine wearing the same shirts, feeding off each other's energy, producing results that neither could fully explain individually. By April 2018, whatever that partnership had been was long over, and both men knew it. Spieth reached out his hand. Reed shook it. The exchange lasted about 3 seconds. Spieth's face was controlled in a way that people's faces usually aren't in genuine moments of warmth. It was the face of a man who understood what was required of him, and was performing it precisely, nothing more. There were no arm-around-the-shoulder moments. There was no private exchange captured on the sideline cameras. There was a handshake, and then Spieth walked away, and the two men who had once been golf's great partnership put the appropriate distance between themselves without any visible discomfort at doing so. That was its own kind of comment. The broader locker room response to Reed's Masters win followed a similar pattern. Players acknowledged it because the game demands that you acknowledge a major. A few offered quotes that hit the expected notes, but the volume of genuine warmth directed at Reed in the aftermath was noticeably lower than it would have been for almost any other winner at Augusta. Other players win the Masters and spend weeks being sought out by peers, doing joint appearances, trading stories about the week. Reed mostly moved through the post-Masters period quietly, with his management team and his wife Justine, who has been one of the few consistent presences in his corner throughout his career. Lee Trevino, one of the great characters in the history of the game, and a man who has watched golf from the inside for 6 decades, summed it up in a way that only Trevino can. He said Reed reminded him of players from an older era, men who won by any means necessary and thought about being liked somewhere down the road, maybe never. Trevino didn't say that was wrong. He had operated in a version of that world himself, coming up through golf without the connections or the background that smoothed other players' paths, having to be harder and more self-reliant than the game's establishment would have liked. He understood the type. He just said there was a particular kind of loneliness that came with it, one that the trophies didn't fix, and that the trophies couldn't touch, because the loneliness wasn't about achievement. It was about the space between you and the people standing in the same room. In 2022, Patrick Reed signed with LIV Golf. For some players, the move to the Saudi-backed breakaway tour was primarily about money. For Reed, it also looked like something else. The PGA Tour locker room had never been his natural home. The players who liked him could be counted on one hand. The ones who didn't had made their feelings known, quietly and consistently for years. LIV offered a fresh start with a smaller field, less team chemistry to navigate, and the kind of individual focus that suited the way Reed actually operated. He confirmed the signing with his usual directness, saying he was excited about the opportunity and that the criticism from PGA Tour players didn't concern him. And in that, at least, he was consistent. Reed has never pretended to chase approval from the men around him. He has always played as if the only validation that matters comes from the scoreboard and the trophy case. The man who opened that door for him was Greg Norman. Norman had spent years constructing LIV Golf as a rival tour with Saudi backing, and he needed names. Not just good players. He needed players who could pull eyeballs, players who carried weight in the American market, players whose arrival would signal to the golf world that LIV was serious. Reed fit that profile. A Masters champion, a former Ryder Cup warrior, a man whose name still generated a reaction in every golf conversation, even if the reaction wasn't always warm. Norman signed him and in doing so made a quiet but pointed statement about what LIV was willing to accept that the PGA Tour had grown reluctant to embrace. Norman's own history with the establishment of professional golf made the pairing fitting in a strange way. Norman had spent decades as one of the best players in the world and had never been fully absorbed into the inner circle of the game's power structure. He had won 2 Open championships, held the world #1 ranking for years, and still felt, by his own account, like someone who operated at an angle to the sport's traditional hierarchy. Whether that outsider identity made him more sympathetic to Reed's situation or whether Reed was simply a useful signing at a useful moment isn't entirely clear. Probably both. But Norman didn't hide the acquisition. He spoke about Reed as exactly the kind of talent LIV was built to attract. Proven, competitive, and available. What Norman didn't say and didn't need to was that Reed was also someone the PGA Tour wasn't fighting particularly hard to keep. McIlroy, who became one of the most vocal opponents of the LIV breakaway, didn't specifically target Reed in his public statements. He didn't need to. The broader argument McIlroy was making, that LIV represented a fracture in the integrity of professional golf, a willingness to take the money and walk away from the sport's traditions, sat awkwardly alongside the Reed narrative that had been building for a decade. McIlroy was talking about values. Reed had spent years being a case study in what happened when competitive excellence and personal conduct pulled in opposite directions. Ernie Els, who captained the international team at the 2019 President's Cup and had watched Reed operate in team environments longer than most, gave one of the more revealing assessments of what Reed brought to any room he entered. Els is a man who has captained, mentored, and competed alongside players at the highest level for 30 years. He doesn't deal in rumor. When he speaks about a player's character, it comes from direct observation. And what Els said about Reed was careful in a way that made it more damaging than anger would have been. He said Reed carried personal baggage into team environments, not professional baggage. Every competitive golfer carries some version of that. Personal baggage. The kind that doesn't stay in the locker room, that bleeds into pairings discussions and practice rounds and the small interactions between players that determine whether a team actually functions as one. Els didn't elaborate at length. He didn't need to. The phrase personal baggage in the mouth of a man with his credibility is its own complete sentence. It confirmed what the PGA Tour's internal dynamics had been suggesting for years, Mike, that the Reed problem wasn't tactical, wasn't about golf at all. It was about something underneath the golf that Reed either couldn't or wouldn't address, and that everyone around him had decided they weren't going to manage on his behalf any longer. Cameron Smith, who joined LIV himself and had crossed paths with Reed in multiple team and individual settings, was the bluntest voice on the specific question of integrity. Smith doesn't dress things up. He's an Australian who plays golf like a tradie who discovered he was gifted at it. Straightforward, competitive, allergic to pretense. When asked about players who had faced rules violation allegations, Smith said plainly that he had no sympathy for cheaters. He didn't say Reed's name in that specific exchange. He didn't have to. The context of the question made it clear what territory the interviewer was mapping, and Smith's answer didn't attempt to redirect it. You either play by the rules or you don't. And Smith's position was that there wasn't a version of professional golf where the distinction was complicated. Coming from someone who had chosen the same tour as Reed, the comment had a particular sharpness. Smith wasn't speaking from outside the LIV world looking in. He was standing inside it and still making the distinction. That's harder to dismiss than criticism from people who had already separated themselves from Reed entirely. Koepka, who also eventually moved to LIV, addressed the Reed situation more directly in interviews. His version was blunt. Reed was good enough to be in any conversation about the best American golfers of his generation, and the fact that so few people wanted to say that out loud was a choice those people were making, not a reflection of the golf. Koepka respected the game Reed played. He just didn't pretend to be his friend. The honest account of Patrick Reed, built from what the men who played alongside him have actually said over the years, doesn't resolve into something clean. Tiger Woods spent years as the most complicated figure in golf, beloved, scrutinized, defended, condemned, and came through it with his legacy largely intact. Because the golf was undeniable. Reed has the golf, 1 major, 8 tour wins. A Ryder Cup record that, in the singles format specifically, puts him among the best Americans who ever played. Those numbers don't move. They sit there, factual and permanent, regardless of what anyone feels about the man attached to them. But unlike Woods, Reed never had the deep reservoir of goodwill that surviving a fall from grace requires. Woods, at his lowest points, still had former caddies willing to defend him, former coaches willing to speak about the quality of the man they'd known, former competitors willing to acknowledge on the record that the person underneath the public image was more complicated and more human than the tabloid version suggested. Reed has almost none of that. The locker room was never on his side. The teammates who could have spoken up for him in the way that Spieth once did and then quietly stopped doing chose silence when it mattered most. And Reed, to his credit or his detriment depending on how you see it, never seemed to ask for anything different. He didn't court them. He didn't change. He played golf and let the results do what he apparently believed they should do. The specific cost of that approach shows up most clearly when you look at the Ryder Cup, the arena where Reed built his name and where the legend of Captain America was born. The Ryder Cup is, at its core, a team event. It runs on trust. It runs on the willingness of 12 players to subordinate individual ego to collective purpose, to celebrate each other's points as if they were their own, to sit in the team room on Sunday morning and genuinely want the men next to them to succeed. Reed was capable of all of that on the golf course. Inside the ropes, he competed for his team with everything he had, and the record shows it. Outside the ropes, in the rooms where teams are built and maintained, he existed in a different dimension to the players around him. The captains who had to manage that reality, Furyk in 2018 most visibly, but others before him who quietly shaped pairings and team structures around the Reed problem, never spoke publicly about the full weight of what they were navigating. Furyk in particular handled it with a professionalism that probably deserved more credit than it received. He found a way to include Reed, to use his talents, to get the most from the situation without letting the locker room dynamics collapse entirely. But the pairings told the story that Furyk's careful interview answers never would. Reed played alone. Again and again, in the format that rewards partnership most, he played alone. That's the image that sits at the center of the Patrick Reed story and won't move. Not the cheating allegations, as serious as those are. Not the legal threats. Not the LIV signing. The image is simpler and sadder than any of those. It's a man in a team uniform, sitting by himself in a room full of people who chose not to sit with him. A man who had just delivered for his country and walked back to a silence that his performance had done nothing to warm. He had given them a point. They had given him a chair at the end of a table. Lee Trevino's observation stays with you, the loneliness that the trophies don't fix. A man who was born for the Ryder Cup stage and ended up eating alone in the locker room. Who became Captain America and then slowly stopped being invited to the team table. Who won a Masters green jacket and couldn't find a playing partner. The legends didn't hate Patrick Reed because he was bad at golf. They were uncomfortable with him because he was very good at it. And because the way he pursued excellence didn't leave much room for the relationships the game is supposed to build. He played like winning was the only thing that mattered. It turned out the men around him had decided that wasn't quite enough. Some golfers are remembered for what they gave the game. Patrick Reed will be remembered for what he took from it. The wins, the moments, the Ryder Cup heroics that genuinely moved people, and for the argument he left unresolved about what it cost to play that way. The case against him is real, and it's documented. Costas saw it 4 times. Chamblay named it directly and refused to walk it back. Ozinger changed the standard applied to him permanently and said so on television. Spieth, who once called him a brother in arms, stopped saying his name. Furyk built pairings around avoiding him. Els said he carried personal baggage into every room he entered. Smith said there was no sympathy for cheaters and didn't bother to look away when he said it. These aren't anonymous sources. These are the men who played alongside him, coached beside him, broadcast him, and captained him. Their accounts overlap. Their observations reinforce each other. The picture they draw individually and together is of a man whose talent was undeniable and whose conduct made that talent nearly impossible to celebrate. And yet the golf sits there, 15 under par at Augusta in April 2018, hands shaking, weeping in front of cameras, green jacket on his shoulders. 3-1, 3-2, 1 up on the final hole at Gleneagles with a crowd cheering against every shot he hit. A Ryder Cup singles record that puts him in the same conversation as the best Americans who ever played the format. You can't take those numbers and make them smaller. They happened, they're permanent, and they were earned in the hardest possible arenas against the best possible opponents, under the kind of pressure that ends most people's stories before they get anywhere close to a major. The tragedy of Patrick Reed, if that's what it is, isn't that he failed. He didn't fail. The tragedy is the gap between what he achieved and what that achievement meant to the people who witnessed it. Other champions walk off the 18th at Augusta and into a locker room that erupts for them. Reed walked off and into quiet. Other warriors come home from Ryder Cups and are celebrated by the men who fought beside them. Reed came home to a table where the seats nearest him were always, somehow, already taken. The legends who stood beside him couldn't agree on how to feel about him, and that disagreement is still running. But not one of them said the golf wasn't real. That might be the most Patrick Reed sentence in the whole story. The golf was always real. Everything else was the problem. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss them. And send your thoughts on Patrick Reed down in the comments below. We want to know where you land on him.